over the past couple of years, having reached a lot in revenue and having met a lot of cool people, I'm not saying I wasn't humble anymore, but I kind of got to this point where what do I call this? I started thinking I didn't have to put in the work anymore. Hello, and welcome to Fail to Win, the show where we love to make mistakes and learn from them so you can turn your passion into profits and live life on your own terms. I'm Amy van der Putten from FastForwardAmy, your host and coach, and I'll bring you a new episode with simple strategies every Tuesday. I'm currently in a podcast studio in LA, and I just wrapped up a recording that I'll be releasing soon with Danielle Canty from Boss Babe. And as I was sitting here, I had so much fun recording that. And I was talking to Oscar, who is here in the room with me, about, Belgium and sending the footage to my team in Belgium. And I told Oscar, it's crazy because 3.5 years ago when I started my podcast, a lot of people thought it was such a stupid idea to give so much value for free. And I remember myself sitting in that tiny room in my apartment, just recording in my PJs, trying to figure out the equipment, hating the way I sounded and thinking like, oh my God, why do you breathe so loudly? And just struggling with the editing. And I actually postponed my podcast twice. That was even before people told me not to do it. So I postponed it twice because I was terrified no one would listen to it. I thought, what if no one will listen to it? Or even worse, what if they listen to it and they don't like it? And I'd made up this story in my brain that if I would publish that podcast episode and people would hate it, it would be such a failure because I'd already built up kind of a name for myself. And maybe you recognize this for yourself. You are at a point where you are good at what you do, but you are afraid to do a new thing within that realm or something entirely different because it feels like you're going to lose face if you become a beginner again. But back then, I kind of got sick of myself. I'd invested in the equipment that I was really shit at figuring out. I had gotten the headshots for the cover photo. I had the podcast cover ready for 6 months. And I was like, Amy, you just have to get over yourself. What's the worst that can happen? So I told myself, okay, the worst that can happen is I publish the episode and people won't like it. Or maybe a few people won't like it and a few people will love it. So I was like, okay, I'm just going to follow the timeline. I'm just going to do what Pat Flynn told me because at the time I'd watched Pat Flynn's podcast course. And I ended up releasing the podcast. And I think in the first day, I got 3,000 downloads. And I'm sitting here now in, West Hollywood? Yeah, West Hollywood in the studio with Oscar by myself. I flew here in business class. I have done 5 million in online sales since releasing that podcast. A big part of those sales are actually thanks to that podcast. And I just interviewed one of the biggest names in the online marketing industry because I did that thing I was bad at and learned to get better at. And I was not afraid, or I was actually really afraid to fail is what I want to say. But the thing is, if I would have never had the dream of writing a New York Times bestseller, I probably also wouldn't have put out the podcast. But I knew that one day I want to have the big guests. One day I want to talk to Tony Robbins was one of the things I wanted to accomplish. And I just knew that not doing the podcast was going to hinder me from attaining that goal. And today is a little bit of a pinch me moment because it just makes me realize if you don't take the first steps, the next steps are never going to happen. Which brings me to another point. So a lot of people told me, don't do it. How long are you going to do that free podcast for? And I was like, yeah, just like as long as it takes. As long as it takes what? And I was like, I don't know. I'm just going to continue doing it. I'd seen Amy Porterfield publish hundreds of podcast episodes. And I was like, okay, I'll just do that. And I was a little bit impatient at the time. So I was like, oh my God, she has hundreds of episodes. If I publish an episode every week for a full year, that's only 52 episodes. It's going to take me 2 years to get 100 episodes. And I'd read somewhere that was the magical, pivotal point. But I was like, yeah, okay, I'm by myself. At the time, I didn't have a full-time team. I had one virtual assistant I was working with. On other stuff, I was just doing the podcast by myself. So I thought, let me just try and start with the once a week. And if at a certain point I can add more, I'll do more. I started with that one podcast. And then I figured out that podcasting was nice and people liked it, and a lot of traffic came into my business. So in my second business, I was like, I think we also need a podcast here because people seem to really love podcasting. And then I was talking to my dad and I told him, you really need a podcast as well. So we co-founded his podcast. And then last year, I noticed a lot of my clients were listening to things and asking me for daily motivation. So I started publishing some of my Dutch content on a different podcast. So 3.5 years since starting the first podcast, there are now 4 podcasts with one has 400,000 views, the other one 200,000, 100,000, all combined. That is, we're nearing 1 million people, or 1 million downloads actually, and listens, which none of that would have happened without pressing that post the first time. And being here in LA, I am feeling incredibly awkward as I'm recording this because I'm not used to Oscar sitting in the room with me. Is one thing. And what I learned last week, seeing Lisa Bilio speak at a retreat I was at, is that it is always good to have a beginner's mindset. And over the years, I seem to have forgotten what I'd learned when I'd released that podcast. So I'm sitting here today talking about why it is so important to allow yourself to be a beginner, to build a really nice brand and then to be really bad at the next thing. Maybe you're a really good writer, but you're afraid to get on stories because you're afraid that you're going to be bad at making videos. Well, you're never going to get good at making videos if you don't start making videos. The beginner's mindset is something that I am not ashamed to say, but I will say it is over the past couple of years, having reached a lot in revenue and having met a lot of cool people, I'm not saying I wasn't humble anymore, but I kind of got to this point where what do I call this? I started thinking I didn't have to put in the work anymore. And Gary Vee says this, he says, eat shit for 5 years, eat caviar for the rest of your life. And I thought I'd already arrived at the caviar piece. And that doesn't mean I wasn't working hard anymore. I'm really proud of my work. I've worked hard on it. I have a lot of really happy customers. But I did start feeling too good to learn new things. But I really do believe that the moment you think you know everything is the beginning of the end. And if you look at the greats in the world, the greats in the industry, they are never afraid to learn something new. They are never afraid to make their hands dirty. They're never afraid to start fresh or to fail. And that brings me to the point of that entire storyline, obviously, is a few months ago, I was on the verge of changing the name of my podcast. And at the time, someone actually told me, because it used to be the FastForwardAmy show, someone had told me like, hey, if you don't get your shit together branding-wise, no one is going to trust you anymore and no one is going to buy from you. And this was based on the fact that I didn't have a clear brand strategy, yet I'd helped thousands of people with their business. I didn't have clear colors or like visual things. Like there were fonts everywhere. My Canva login is a true mess. And I got so afraid when that person said that I was like, okay, paralysis. And I started being afraid of making choices. And one of the names I'd had for my podcast back then, I'd realized I need to change the podcast name because I don't want it to be about me. I want it to be about the people I want to help. And Play to Win was one of the names that came up for me. But I got so paralyzed that I was afraid to change the name. And a few months ago, I was reminded of my roots of fast forward being do something perfectly imperfect. You can always change it afterwards. So I was like, okay, you know what? Let's just go. I still am not 100% sure if it's Play to Win, but let's just plug it in there and let's just roll, 2 months later, I just told my team, I think we need to change the name again. And I was convinced in the beginning of the year, like, I can't change the name twice. Like, I really can't do that. Guess what? I'm changing the name twice in 1 year because I've realized, yeah, Play to Win is right. But you know what's even more true? It's fail to win. Because we cannot win without failing. We cannot win without experimenting. We cannot win without allowing ourselves to be a beginner at any new adventures we endeavor on, or whatever you want to call that. So today I proudly present to you, wow, that was difficult to say. I'm going to say that again. Today I proudly present to you the new version of the podcast, the Fail to Win podcast, where you will meet many, many guests talking about how they have failed their way to success each and every day. many failures I have had and how winning looks different for each and every one of us. So before I close off this little mini introduction episode, I want to ask you, what do you want to win at? And especially, what do you need to allow yourself to fail at in order to get there? What do you need to post that you're afraid of? What do you need to embrace in your identity that you aren't good at yet? If your win is big enough, you're going to be able to allow yourself to fail. But if you don't dream big enough, it's going to be really difficult to get out of your comfort zone. So I'm here to normalize failure is normal. Failure is not bad. Failure is just learning as long as we keep trying and experimenting. So have a happy day. And a day where you haven't failed is a day where you haven't learned.